Sir James D.J. Brown, who is an international affairs expert and associate professor of political science at Temple University, Japan campus, joining us live from Japan's capital, Tokyo. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us here on the broadcast on WION World is One. Help us understand as to at what stage Japan is in terms of fighting the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, in some ways it's quite surprising, the situation in which Japan finds itself, because in many ways it was one of the first countries to end up with infections of the coronavirus. You might expect that given Japan's closeness and extensive economic ties with China. But subsequent to that, within Japan, it's been a very slow burn. We haven't seen this huge surge in cases early on, as occurred in Italy, Spain, and then the UK. And so despite the early arrival of the virus, it's now only these many weeks later that Japan seems to be finding itself in a more difficult situation. Now, I should say that there haven't as yet been the very sharp increases in deaths that we've seen elsewhere. The number is still only around 200 fatalities. But still, at the moment in Japan, there's a real sense of fear that, in a strange way, Japan's still at an early stage of this outbreak.
Right. And there are still questions hovering around the authorities in Japan about testing and, more importantly, their initial reaction to this entire pandemic because of the fact that they had an Olympics lined up when the news first broke. That Olympics has now been pushed to the next year. The question is, how well can Japan, contain the situation and be better prepared for the Olympics coming up next year?
Well, you're right. There have been very big questions about testing because, while some countries, most notably Germany, were very quick to introduce mass testing, within Japan they were very reluctant to do that. In part, there was a fear that if they began to test too many people, they would all be hospitalized and the healthcare system would collapse. So actually, Japan's been really quite reluctant to do that, which has then led to some questions about their response. As to the Olympics, there were also worries that perhaps the government's response was slow precisely because they didn't want to reveal the extent of the problem whilst there was still a possibility of the Olympics going ahead. I think that's unfair. I think it's rather that simply the conditions weren't that bad until recently. Now, the Olympics, the loss of them this year is a huge disappointment for Japan, but there's the hope that they will become the recovery Olympics next year, the recovery not just for Japan, but also for the global economy.
Right. Professor, I also wanted to ask you about Japan vis-a-vis its neighboring countries, and more importantly, you see a surge of a second wave of infections in Singapore. In a sense, what exactly is happening in Japan? It reported numbers before the numbers came down, and then everything got postponed, and now there is a resurgence in the cases in capital Tokyo, to be specific.
Yes, that's right. In Japan now, the numbers are very much going up. But it's not so much a second wave here in the same way that we've seen perhaps a second wave in Singapore or indeed in China itself. It's really a first wave. And the numbers of infections have gone up, particularly within Tokyo, but then spreading further throughout the country. And at the moment, the Japanese government is really running to catch up. They started off with this declaration of an emergency within just a few prefectures. They then decided to expand it nationwide. So the social distancing measures so far have been quite limited. For example, I can still kind of go out of my house for any reason that I like. There's no enforcement of the police saying that you have to stay in. A lot of the measures have simply been voluntary. But there's the possibility that the measures, as far as the law permits, will become tougher from now.
What does this nationwide emergency mean? This was an emergency that was declared in Tokyo and 6 other prefectures initially, and now there's a nationwide emergency. How does it change things on the ground in Japan? And more importantly, how does it help Japan flatten the COVID-19 curve, so to speak?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, because I think people hearing the idea of a state of emergency would imagine that it's much more strict than it really is. But because of some legal peculiarities about Japan, actually the government doesn't have really extensive emergency powers. So despite the announcement of a statewide, a nationwide emergency, it doesn't mean that the government can apply that much. What it really does is allow the prefectural governors to take stronger steps. For example, requiring certain businesses to sell certain goods, potentially to take over some areas for medical facilities, but it doesn't allow the government to say that individuals must stay within their homes. It doesn't even allow the government to force all businesses to close. So really, it's not like a lockdown, a shutdown, like we've seen elsewhere, and that's precisely for legal reasons. The Japanese constitution does not allow that sort of state of emergency to be called.
Professor James D.J. Brown, International Affairs expert and Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University in Japan, joining us live from Tokyo with that perspective. Thank you so much for being with us here on the broadcast on Beyond World is One and sharing your thoughts.